How's everyone feeling this morning? Louder. Come on, you had breakfast. You already got breakfast. Let's do this again. How are you guys feeling this morning? Slightly better. We can do this a little better, I can't speak up because then it'll blow your ears, but you can speak up. So, how are you guys doing today? That's better. Alright, so I'm going to speak about something today that I've been interested in for a very long time, and it's going to be a little difficult to understand, so I hope I'm able to pass my message through. Hey Anand, I'm good to go, right? Alright, so I'm not going to use any slides today, I'm just going to use a bunch of browser tabs. So let's start with this one. This is my GitHub profile. As you can see, I write a lot of code. It's something I do pretty much on a daily basis. That's my last 1 year of coding. And what I'm going to talk about today is the paradox of being a good programmer. On the one hand, there's this theory that to be good at anything, you need to do a lot of it. And you need to do it over and over again. It's been made popular by this particular phrase, which, as you know, came from a book by Malcolm Gladwell. And it's you may or may not agree with him, but it's a very interesting way to capture it. It basically says that if you need to be good at anything, you need to do a lot of it. Without practice, you're never going to be a good programmer. All the same, in the industry, this is not always considered as the best wisdom. There is the opposite viewpoint. I hope you guys can read it. I'll zoom in otherwise. Can you read that out? Functionality is an asset, but code is a liability. I'll say this until you like it. This essentially says, if you write code, you have a problem on your hands. Now, this guy is not the only one to say this. Here's someone else. Source code is a liability, not an asset. In other words, don't write code. Write less code. I hope you guys are seeing a pattern here. That good programmers seem to think that if you're writing code, you're doing something wrong. You should not be writing code. The art of being a good programmer is you write as little code as you can. So what's going on there? More people saying this. Don't write any code at all. This guy's got something interesting. His code is bad, it rots, it has maintenance problems, and so on and so forth. So, what do you do here? Now people are getting into the negative side. Remove code. That makes you a better programmer. Anyone got ideas on what the heck is going on here? I mean, we started with the first one. 10,000 hours of practice. If you don't write code, you're never going to be a good programmer. But the hallmark of a good programmer is that he doesn't write code. How is this supposed to work? How are you supposed to become a good programmer if the good programmers don't write code? So, I'm going to tell you a story of how I learned how this actually works, slightly the hard way. It's slightly long. So it starts back in 2001 when I built my website. It looked like this in that period. So it looks like a page, but it's actually coming out of an application server. Back then, there was a Python application server called Zope. Who's heard of Zope? You guys are aware that the company that made Zope actually hired Guido van Rossum, the guy who created Python. So Zope was really, really important in the late 90s and early 2000s. And I became a Zope programmer back then because I discovered it and I thought it was fabulous. Like you can write programming code that turns into web pages. And so this is what it started like. By 2009, it was looking like this. And this is now a website that runs in Plone. So I'd essentially moved my blog here. And now who's worked with Plone? Plone users? You guys like it? I see that. Yeah, that is basically what happens if you use Plone. So what happens when you use a piece of code that is built up over a 10-year period is at some point it's going to be fairly crafty. Yeah? It's grown in response to people's requirements over a long period of time until it gets to the point where you look at it and says, why the heck am I using this stuff? It's time to move on and do something else. And so I had gotten to this point by about 2009. And meanwhile, I had also been using a network called LiveJournal for a very long time. So this is what it looks like if you look at it today. This is my very first post in 2000. So I had like 10 years of my life archived on some website, which I did not know was going to remain forever. Now, as you all know, web services die. Fortunately, this one's not dead, but web services die. You use something, eventually the company that runs it gets tired of doing it, they get sold off, and the new company says this does not make sense, and they shut down the project, and your data is gone. It's happened with Google Reader of all things, that service that you guys depend on so much. So I was looking at LiveJournal and thinking, I don't know if this thing is going to remain, and it's got an archive of my life as I was growing up. It's extremely important to me. I want this on my own website. I want my own blog. So in 2009, I started searching for good blogging software that could archive my previous blog posts. And obviously the most obvious candidate is WordPress. So I looked at WordPress, I tried importing my data, and in the process of trying to use WordPress in a non-standard way, because most people start blogging with WordPress. For me, I was trying to import old code into WordPress, old archives into WordPress. I ended up discovering that I didn't like WordPress at all. I wasn't going to go anywhere near it ever again. So my search for a blogging tool led me to, through this phase, I'll get to this, I ended up looking at something called Zine. This is a blogging engine written in Python. Look at this, is wow, I can actually edit this code. It's a language I understand. It's not going to leave me in a situation where if it doesn't work, it doesn't work because I don't know how to fix it. I know how to fix Python code, so I'm going to use this. So I started working in Python, and I ended up becoming a contributor to this project. So Zine was hosted on Bitbucket. It was open source. You could go look at the code. You can look at the code even now. This is a live URL. You can go there, start working on it, and do stuff with it. And so I ended up being a contributor. You can see that I ended up making a lot of commits to the main Zine repository. You can also see this Anand Chittiputhu showing up over there trying to do Telugu translations. I don't know if you remember any of this, Anand. So I became a contributor, started sending in code to Zine, and at some point I came up against the design decisions that the creator of Zine had made. Now this was a guy named Armin. I'm sure all of you know him, even if you don't realize who I'm talking about. So one of the things that Zine did is it stored data in MySQL, and MySQL, as you know, is a relational database. And when you model data, you're often going to run into scenarios where you're looking at basically key value pairs. And you're going to look at this and say, dude, trying to represent a key value pair in an RDBMS is painful. So what do? You try to dump it into a text area. Okay? A good programmer is supposedly going to normalize the data and make sure it's distributed across tables. A lazy programmer will say, screw this, I'm just going to dump it in a text area. Anyway, I'm not doing a query on this. So Armin had made one such decision, and he used Python pickles. Who's familiar with Python pickles? Python pickles? You guys know it. Do you know what the problem with pickles is? Anyone want to speak about what is the most fundamental problem? Security is one. What's the second most important problem? Okay. So you see what happens when you get into something that's very language specific like a pickle. It's an excellent way to dump data and read it back. If you're going to dump data, keep it and read it back. By the time you read it back, the code that is reading it may be different code from the code that wrote it. So it is not something you use for storage. And this is something I learned working with Zope and Plone. One of the main problems with Zope and Plone was that the Zope object database is a pickle-based database. And it essentially means that the data is dependent on your code because it basically is a dump of your class. When you read it back, if your class is different, you can't read it back anymore. So it essentially says that your code is not tied to your data, and if you make a mistake over there, it's not going to be readable. So I was looking at Armin's code and saying, you know what, I understand why you use pickles, but I don't like this. It's going to cause problems 5 years later on the line when I try to do something else, when I'm trying to upgrade my code. So I told him, why don't you use JSON? So this is a patch I sent in. It said, let's stop using pickles. We'll store data as JSON. Okay. But obviously you have people using the software already who have data that's currently stored as a pickle. So I wrote in a class that said it will store as JSON and it will read as either JSON or pickle, so that old data can be transparently migrated. Now this is one of the fads when you're using any kind of NoSQL database, that you don't bother to do schema migrations when your code changes. You do a schema migration when you actually need the data. So this is what I've done, and Armin looked at this and said, I don't like this. I'm not going to accept this patch. And his main problem was, this was not good code. It was not good code not because it didn't work. It was good code because it mixed up concerns. Data migration is not a runtime concern, in his opinion. He said you need to write a migration that basically says this database is against version X of Zyme and you want to move it to version Y of Zyme, so you write a migration that converts your data from the old to the new, and this is not the way you do it. I was looking at this and said, what the heck is a migration? I've never heard of this term before. Now, unlike most people who come from an RDBMS background, I came from a background in SOAP, which is a NoSQL database. And in a NoSQL database, you don't do schema migrations until you actually need the data. So looking at this and saying, you know, this doesn't make any sense to me given the way I have learned to be a programmer. And I like this code, I'm going to keep it. So I ended up building my website completely on my own fork of Zyme. And what I would do is every couple of days I would look at the main Zyme commit tree, and if I see a commit, I would import it into mine, keep it in my fork, but obviously I could not send my patches back, so I had to send a patch back one at a time. Okay, and Zyme used Mercurial. Mercurial has a plugin that lets you transfer commits one commit at a time. You know, normally when you do a git push, you're basically sending a whole bunch of commits, your entire branch, whatever has changed from upstream. Okay, Mercurial had an ability to send only one patch at a time. So you could say, pick this patch and send it to the upstream side. And that was great because I could keep this patch and send everything else. So I did this for a few months until I eventually got to the point where I didn't have the time for this maintenance work anymore. Yeah? That I had now come down a path where this code was my problem alone because I'm the only guy using this patch. And thanks to this patch, I can't simply use the master tree anymore. I need to keep one patch aside and sync my tree with the master tree every few commits. So this went on for a while, and eventually Armin got bored of of Zyme, and figured this was not interesting because he thought his code had even more fundamental problems, and this was just a trivial problem, that there were more fundamental problems in his own design. So he eventually said, I'm not going to do this, and he gave up on the project. Now what happened is, this was 2009. In 2010, this came out. Who remembers this? Okay, so this came out on April 1st, 2010. And it said, micro frameworks are all the rage these days. Nobody wants too much code. I'm going to build a framework that has basically just this much code in it. Look at this. This is all it takes to run a website. This was fabulous, and this thing went top rank on Hacker News. Nobody bothered to look at the code, and they didn't realize this was actually an April 1st joke. So the April 1st joke, as it turns out, wasn't a terrible idea. So 3 days later, he goes back and says, I did this and I wanted to troll the community that is basically excited about a bunch of ideas and so forth. And he ended up doing all of this, and he said that it looks like it's only 160 lines of code, but it basically does a lot of bullshit. But as you get to the bottom, there's something interesting you should notice. Look at the tag over there at the bottom. You see the You guys see the tag on the post? Does it look familiar now? So denied, as it turns out, came back in 2 days as Flask. And you look at the code, it's exactly the same code as you saw in denied just now. But this one is actually done right. And it was actually about 160 lines of code. That was all the framework was. So clearly this guy is a good programmer. I think most of us agree implicitly by the fact that we actually use this stuff. Now who uses Flask over here? A lot of you guys. Okay. Why do you use Flask? It's simple. You can keep it in your mind. It's a simple enough API that the whole thing in your head, you don't need to read the documentation. Anything else? It's light. More? So that's a bunch of good reasons. Okay? And you remember the principles that we discussed early on. A good programmer writes very little code. But to be a good programmer, you need practice, which means you write a lot of code. Here's your scenario. How did this guy become such a good programmer who could do so much in just 160 lines of code, which is what Flask was? It was basically just dependent on a bunch of libraries. And it boiled down what used to be millions of lines of code in content management frameworks into basically just 160 lines of code that anybody could use to build a website. And I know this because I use it and I run a bunch of sites, and so do a lot of you guys. So this is where you get the paradox of the good programmer. You must write a lot of code to be a good programmer and know what works, what doesn't work. But the hallmark of a good programmer is that he has very little code. And how do you get that? You get there by throwing away your code, which is basically what Armin did with Zyne. Now, side effect to that is my blog as it stands today. This is what you get if you go visit my blog today. Okay. It's been like this for about a month. Some of you guys remember have been complaining saying you can't access my blog anymore. Any of you guys? I know Anand was one. Anand has been busy linking to archive.org, telling people that this is my blog. But to show you what it actually looked like, this is what it looked like when it was working. This is a page from archive.org, and this is running on Zyne. And for the longest time, I was one of the only people still using Zyne after Armin had abandoned it, after everybody else had abandoned it. And I was writing on a fork that I had created in 2009, and since then I had not had the time to update, but did my job, so I was using it. Now, how did we go from that to this? What happened was, I upgraded my server. I was running on Ubuntu Lucid, LTS, and I figured LTS stopped maintenance this year. So I'm going to move it to the next one, which is 12.04, which is precise. So I did an Ubuntu upgrade, and the next thing I know, I've got this, and it says, what the heck just happened here? And it turns out that the upgrade breaks MySQL. It doesn't work anymore. You need to uninstall it and reinstall it, but it took me a long time to figure this out. It's like, because MySQL doesn't start, and nothing in the log messages tells you why it's not starting. So I figured that out. It turns out there's also an API difference in SQL Alchemy, which has changed. And one of the things that happens when you do an OS upgrade is that your Python interpreter is basically going to change. In this case, it moved from 2.6 to 2.7. And therefore, even if you had a virtual env, some of it is going to break. Your base library has changed. You need to rebuild your environment for Python. And I had essentially ended up in a Python environment with a new version of SQL Alchemy, which was incompatible with the Zyne fork that I had in 2009. And I'm looking at this point and says, I don't have the time to fix this. Okay? I just don't, because I'm busy with work. This is a hobby. It doesn't make me money. I don't care about this really, because nobody's affected if this site doesn't work. But I don't have a site anymore. And why don't I have a site anymore? Because it's my code. Nobody else has this problem. So this is essentially one of the things that we learn the hard way. Now this makes sense, does it? Functionality is an asset, code is a liability. You want the blog, you don't want the damn code and its problems. So this is where you get to the point of saying, how do you get past this problem? Okay? And this is really one of the beautiful things about open source. This is basically how it works. the guys who create GitHub, this is the CEO of GitHub, who, as it turns out, is a programmer despite his CEO title. And what he says is open source everything, right? Or at least as much as you can. And you guys should read this post. It just goes on and on about all the different ways in which it's a good thing to open source. Okay, I'm going to read just the words it is highlighted. Great advertising, force multiplier, attract talent, best technical interview possible, retain the talent, effortless modularization, reduce duplication of effort. It's the right thing to do. Bunch of reasons why you should open source. Well, obviously I was using open source. I didn't skip the problems. So what's the deal? Now, there's something else I wrote a little while ago that's probably relevant. And it comes down to understanding what open source really is. Open source is not about the code. Open source is about responsibility for the code. That is the fundamental idea. Somebody else is responsible for this code. If it breaks, I'm not the only guy with the problem. Somebody else has the same problem. They are also going to try to fix it. And essentially, if nobody else is taking responsibility for this code, then there is no point to it being open source. So this is fundamentally it. And let's see what I got next. Now let's look at what people are doing. I'm giving up random examples of people who have decided to open source and done a proper job of it. So why would you open source? You have built some code that solved your problem, but the problem that you have solved is not what makes your business run. Your business runs on something else. The functionality that you provide is several layers above this. Okay? And you've got some code that you need, but maintaining it is a lot more expensive than creating code. It was easy for me in 2009 to jump into Zine and say, I'm going to make some patches and create myself a blog. But in 2013, I don't have the time to maintain it. And my time in 2013 is a lot more expensive than my time was in 2009, which basically means then that for the functionality I got by writing my own code back then, I'm going to pay a price that is much, much higher than the cost of writing that code back then. Okay? In essence, maintenance costs are always a lot more than creation costs when you write software. And what you need to know is how to avoid having that maintenance cost completely on yourself. Okay? Open source is a mechanism of distributing the maintenance costs by saying, I made something that is useful to me, that I need, but that does not make me money, because I make money several layers up on top of it. Nobody makes money selling a chart. Square, as you know, is a payment processor. They do credit card payments. That's how they make money. Okay? Part of their process, obviously, is they need to watch what's happening on their network, who's making how many transactions around the world. So they build charting software that is capable of doing real-time processing with vast amounts of data and so forth. And by open sourcing this, what they've essentially done is given this code as a gift to the community, but also got maintenance in returns. Now there are a lot of examples of this, and you'll see this over and over again. Zerb Foundation. Who's heard of this? Now, do you guys know what the heck Zerb is? Who's aware of what Zerb is? It's a web design company. So Zerb is a company that you hire to do web design for your company. Okay? They are an agency. And one of the things that happens as an agency is you're making websites day in and day out. Eventually you realize that some parts of making a website are the same across all websites. Some parts obviously are unique to each website. Okay? So you take the parts that are the same everywhere. Things like having a grid structure so that you can do content in columns and do layouts on your screen is obviously a recurring idea. So these guys got to the point where they figured that this recurring pattern in how to do layout of a website is something they could just give away to the community and say, everybody use this please. And by the way, you can help us fix it in obscure browsers that we don't have the time to test in. Great idea, right? So that's really how Foundation came up. And Foundation made it possible for an even more famous project. You guys have heard of this. Okay? Even if you have not heard of it, you've used it. 1% of all websites in the world use Bootstrap today. It's a huge, huge, huge thing. So What's the deal with Bootstrap? Who makes Bootstrap? Twitter? Why is Twitter, a company that does tweeting, making Bootstrap a framework for websites? It's obvious, right? That this is what they use for their own website. And essentially, it's again a collection of good ideas that they have used to build their website, that they've figured trying to keep up with browsers and their changes, and these changes happen every few months nowadays, is pretty much impossible if you don't involve more people in the process. So Bootstrap essentially has become their way of saying, let's get this out into the community, let them take it over, and let's make everybody's websites better so that our support cost goes down. For examples closer home. You guys know Flipkart. What does Flipkart do? They sell stuff. They do e-commerce. Why does Flipkart have a GitHub account? Does anybody think Flipkart is obviously a technology company, given that they're primarily in the business of selling stuff? Now they're a smart company. So these are guys who figured out that the way to do anything these days involves writing software, and you need to write a lot of software that nobody else will ever use, because basically they were one of the first big e-commerce companies in the country. So it's not like you could go to somewhere else and say, let's look at what Myntra is doing and we'll copy them, because they were ahead of the game already. So you have an example again of guys who figured they need to write their own software to manage servers because this stuff does not exist. Now, unlike Amazon, which essentially built their technology before the cloud existed and they made the cloud, Flipkart is a company that came in post-cloud. That they came in at a time when the idea of the cloud was already well established, the technologies were well understood, but the stuff was not readily available open source. You could use AWS, but you don't get Amazon's code. So Flipkart ended up being a company that had to basically build an open source version of everything themselves. And thankfully they're smart enough to actually open source it. And you'll see why. And not just open source it, but they go out and talk about it. So you can see their slides. It tells you everything about how it works. It's all there, okay? The code is there, the explanation is there, it's public. And it's something that essentially gets people to notice also. Now this is a guy who happens to work at Microsoft. I know this, he doesn't mention it on the blog, but I've spoken to him. But example of a guy who is essentially looked at someone and said, okay, I understand what this company is doing. Okay? And it makes sense. So this is pretty much all I have to say today. It comes down to this. To be a good programmer, you need to write a lot of code. But the hallmark of a good programmer is that you write less code. Why do you write less code? Because it's not the code that's a problem, it's maintenance that's a problem. And one way to do this is to understand this as less code that is yours to maintain. Not less code overall, but code that is not your problem. And the way to do that is convince others to use it. Convince others to depend on it so that they will maintain it for you. And when that happens, you got a situation where you've basically got the benefit of the code, but not the liability of the code. Okay. So that's really all I have to say here, and thank you. So yeah, I'm open to questions. I don't know how much time we have. Yeah.
If you have questions, you can raise your hand.
So
But does this mean proprietary software development in the commercial organizations is not a good model at all?
So it depends on what is proprietary in most proprietary organizations. If it's a service firm, then it's usually somebody else's code. It's not really their code. If it's a product firm, then some code is theirs. And you take the GitHub example. They put it very nicely. They say almost everything, not everything. Okay. And so the question then is, what does that mean? So the functionality and the code that delivers the functionality is obviously something you can't afford to give away all the time. Sometimes you can. Now, for instance, if you're building something that essentially depends on network effects and users using it, it doesn't matter if it's open source. Take the case of Reddit. If I understand right, Reddit is an open source website. You can copy the code and make your own Reddit. But will you steal Reddit's traffic in the process? You're not. Because it's a domain name that is your actual intellectual property, not the source code. Okay. So essentially, a lot of people who think of code as intellectual property tend to misplace the actual property value in this. That often it's not the code, but the usage of the code, and the usage of the code may not necessarily be dependent on the code itself.
Yeah, thank you for the informative talk. When I heard the title, I initially thought you're going to talk about how Python is used for writing less code, because compared to other languages like, for example, C, you probably write less code and it's probably less to maintain. Would you like to share that perspective, because that also adds to the maintainability, right? I mean, the more lines of code.
Absolutely.
And one more, probably an additional question is, usually programmer productivity is measured in terms of lines of code.
Yes.
And recently,
That's
I think
completely a flawed measure.
exactly. So somebody like Martin Fowler recently wrote about how it's a wrong measure, but we don't have any other measure, possibly the best we can have. So would like to hear your thoughts on that.
So it's quite unfortunate that lines of code is considered a good measure, because what that means is you insert blank lines all over your place when you've done your job. Okay. So in my opinion, trying to use that as a way to measure is a waste of time, and it basically reflects irresponsibility at a higher level. That whoever is supposed to measure your actual performance is not doing their job. It's basically just that. But in terms of writing less code, mainly because of the language ability, absolutely. Python's fantastic. There are other languages that claim to be better. They may or may not be true, but what depends usually is not the language itself, but the libraries that it comes with. If you have libraries to do the job, that's really what counts. And in essence, you look at a language's value to you in terms of the library that it comes with, okay? Or in terms of what modules are able to do what. And Python's, fortunately for us, a language that's got a fantastic array of libraries. It's got a very great built-in standard library, and it's got PyPy, and it's got a huge framework of libraries that do pretty much everything. So that's the nice thing about it, and I think there's no point to, there's no reason to reinforce that point, because it's accepted nowadays. That it is a good language for a whole bunch of things.
Hi, thanks for the awesome talk. My name is Rohit. I'm from Plevo. I have a question that it's good to open source, but I've seen that in most open source projects, the number of active or the main contributors are very less, like less than
that means you need to be
10.
careful.
So how do we solve this problem?
So the maintainers are not doing a good job. That's what it means. So a good open source project is one that has a lot of users. And essentially, open source is not magic dust. You don't sprinkle open dust on your software and make it better. It's a process. And if you don't pursue the process aggressively, if you don't go advertise your project, now if you look at what Armin did with Denied, okay, it may have been trolling, but it got people's attention. And when he opened Flask in a couple of days, it got enough attention for Flask that today Flask has no problem with shortage of contributors. So that's the important thing, that when you open source, you must campaign for users. You must campaign for contributors. If you're not doing that, then there's no point to open sourcing it.
So this also requires extra cost. So
it is, but it's not the same cost as maintenance cost.
Okay.
It's a different sort of cost.
Okay.
Someone up there.
Hey Kiran, I'm specifically here not to ask you anything, but we are an organization. We have been for 26 years almost using open source, and I think in a way, rather than listening it from other places, reading it from other places, you've actually given a very informative talk. about code being a liability, and we are in that phase right now, right, of using code in a different language. But yeah, the same question what he asked about using Python to write less number of lines or less number of code is what has been a query for me as well. But since that has been asked, I don't have to ask it again. Okay. Right? But yeah, code is definitely a liability, and we know that for now, right? And I just wanted to say thank you.
Thank you.
So I'm still trying to absorb what you said in your talk. I haven't completely understood it yet. I will think over it. But the question that I have right now is, what do you think about writing tests for your code? Would writing tests decrease maintenance?
Yes, it absolutely does. It's something that most people think is grudge work, and that it's a tester's job. But in my opinion, every programmer should write their own tests. And your goal should always be get to at least 100%.
Any more questions?
There's one in the back. I don't know how much time we have. Oh, we have 10 more minutes. Okay, fabulous.
Yeah, my name is Rakesh. Thanks for the talk. I just want to know, like, how does license make a difference in open source community?
It's 1 hour more, man. License makes all the difference. Let's put it that way. So,
if code is not an asset and it's a liability, then why would they have licensing?
Because most people don't understand the liability part of it really well. Open source licenses, they basically fall into 2 brackets. There is the restrictive licenses and the permissive licenses. Okay? Both under the category of open source, or other way you can say is the copyleft licenses and the non-copyleft licenses. And the copyleft licenses are essentially the GPL, AGPL, and to some extent the LGPL. The permissive licenses in general are the BSD, MIT, Apache, and so forth. And in my opinion, never touch GPL code. Okay? But you may disagree with me, and you can have your reasons for that. I'm okay with LGPL, but otherwise I only work with code that is BSD, MIT, or Apache licensed. Obviously, somebody is going to come and argue with me for saying something like this, so we'll take that offline. Okay.
My question is more on Python in education.
Yes.
There's a big push to involve students with programming in Python.
Yes.
For their education-based projects. Do you think that's maybe a bad thing because they would not get introduced to the low-level stuff?
Not necessarily. I think the world is large.
Okay.
Nobody is ever going to learn enough of anything. So it doesn't really matter if you're saying learn something, as long as it opens up access to a bunch of other things. Okay? And low-level is valuable. I've done a fair bit of low-level when I was younger, but I use none of it today. And it doesn't really matter to me for the kind of work that I do. So I think it's not really sensible to say you can do this but not that because it's not good for you and so forth. In general, people should be left to discover whatever they feel like is valuable to them. Low level is making a comeback these days with mobile devices because once again you're in a situation where you have low power requirements, and Python's not turned out to be a suitable language for mobile phone development. So that's a case where if you look at what say Apple is now saying, they're saying even garbage collection is bad. You need to do manual memory management as the only way to get good performance on an iPhone. So you're seeing this happen over and over again in different scenarios. Sometimes you hear one thing is great, sometimes you hear another thing is great, and the scenario changes. So the only sensible way to understand this is let people figure it out for themselves.
But how intelligent are students at that age to figure that out?
If you start with assuming they're not intelligent enough, they'll never get anywhere.
All right.
Any more questions? Sorry, I can't come to the balcony.
Yeah, I'm sorry. If anyone's upstairs, you'll
can
have
throw
to
the
come
mic.
to ask questions. Okay, I guess that's about it. So thanks everyone. It's been great.